The history of American organized crime has always had women in it, not on the margins, not in supporting roles, not as wives who looked the other way, women who built the operations, who made the decisions, who ordered the violence, who ran the money, and who in several cases built empires larger and more sophisticated than anything the men around them managed to put together. The history books and the documentaries and the true crime podcasts spend most of their time on the men. The women who ran these organizations tend to get footnotes when they deserve chapters. These are 7 of those chapters. 7 women who rose to the absolute top of the drug trade in America in different cities, different eras, different products, using different methods, and who demonstrated that the most dangerous operators in the history of American organized crime were not always who everyone assumed they were. Some of them are household names in the true crime world. Others are known mostly to the detectives who built cases against them and to the residents of the neighborhoods where they operated. All 7 built something that, at the time, most of the country simply refused to believe a woman could build. Brandy Davis, the BMF Queenpin of Detroit. Brandy Davis grew up in Detroit as the daughter of Charles Davis, a well-known drug dealer whose earnings kept the family in a comfortable, suburban-seeming life. She has said she did not fully understand where the money came from until she was around 11 years old, and that by then, the business her father ran was already a fixture of her childhood, present in the cars, the houses, and the men who moved through her family's orbit. Watching friends, fathers get killed was part of growing up in that world. So was learning, without being formally taught, how a serious drug operation is actually run. As a young woman, she relocated from Detroit to Atlanta, and it was there that she connected with the Black Mafia family, the organization built by Demetrius Big Meech Flenory and his brother Terry Southwest. T. Flenory, that would go on to become one of the largest cocaine distribution networks in the country. Davis moved inside that world, building relationships with people at the center of an operation that was, at its height, moving extraordinary volumes of product through a network stretching from Atlanta to Los Angeles. She took what she learned there, combined it with the infrastructure and connections her father had already built in Detroit, and returned home to run a drug distribution operation of her own, rising to prominence as one of the city's significant dealers in a trade her father had helped normalize for her a decade earlier. Her operation came apart the way many of the operations in this history came apart, through the people closest to her. In 2009, her house was raided by federal agents. A close friend was caught with 30 kilos and cooperated with investigators almost immediately. Her boyfriend at the time, known as JT, also began working with the government, and his cooperation became central to the case against her. Her father, Charles Davis, was indicted the following January. Brandy Davis was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Her father received 8. She has said that she watched her father die while she was still incarcerated, following his final moments over a video call because she could not be there in person. Since her release, Davis has become one of the more visible former Queenpins connected to the Black Mafia family's history, speaking at length in interviews about her upbringing, her rise, the people she knew inside BMF, and the collapse of that organization after Big Meech and Southwest T were arrested. She has been direct about the fact that the people she trusted most were the ones who ultimately brought the case against her, a pattern that recurs across nearly every organization in this history, regardless of who was running it. Jemicker Thompson, the crack queen of Los Angeles. Jemicker Thompson grew up in South Central Los Angeles in the 1970s in the same streets that would become the epicenter of the crack cocaine epidemic a decade later. She had a child at a young age and limited access to any conventional path toward financial stability. What she had was intelligence, organizational ability, and proximity to the drug trade through a partner who was already dealing cocaine. She started by learning how the operation worked. Then she started running pieces of it. Then, after her partner was arrested, she took it over entirely. By the mid-1980s, Jemicker Thompson was running one of the largest crack cocaine distribution networks in Los Angeles, supplying dealers across multiple neighborhoods in South Central with a consistency and a quality that established her operation as the dominant supply source in the market she controlled. Her specific organizational skill was in understanding the distribution infrastructure that made crack profitable at scale. She did not just sell cocaine, she ran a business with suppliers, distributors, retail outlets, and enforcers, all coordinated through a management structure she directed personally. She controlled pricing, she handled supply disruptions, she resolved disputes between members of her network. She did all of this while raising a child and while maintaining a public profile low enough that law enforcement was significantly slower to focus on her than on many of her male contemporaries, who were generating less revenue but drawing more attention. At her peak, her operation was generating millions of dollars annually. She was eventually arrested and convicted in 1991 on federal drug trafficking charges. She received a lengthy federal sentence and served years in prison before her release. After her release, Thompson did something that distinguishes her from most of the figures in this history. She became a public advocate around drug policy and the young people in the communities the crack epidemic had devastated. She wrote about her experiences, spoke publicly, and engaged with the harm her operation had contributed to in ways that reflected something more than managed public relations. Whether that work adequately addresses what the organization she built did to South Central Los Angeles is a question without a clean answer. That she engaged with it at all, honestly, publicly, and at real personal cost to her public narrative is itself notable. Avonda, Black Girl. Dowling, the Queen of Overtown. In the world of Miami organized crime in the 1980s and 1990s, a world that had been shaped by the cocaine cowboys, by the Medellin cartel's American distribution network, and by the violent gang wars that followed the crack epidemic into Miami's poorest neighborhoods, Avonda Dowling built something that even the men who ran the city's most violent organizations approached with a specific kind of wariness. She was known on the streets of Overtown as Black Girl. She was also known as Vonda, and her organization was called Vonda's Gang, a name that law enforcement attached to it, even though Dowling herself would likely have described it as something more informal. She ran a drug distribution operation out of Overtown that at its peak controlled a significant share of the crack and powder cocaine market in one of Miami's most densely populated and most economically deprived neighborhoods. Retired Miami-Dade homicide detective Jeff Lewis, who spent years investigating the bloody gang war between Vonda's organization and the Booby Boys led by Kenneth Williams, said something about Dowling that stays with anyone who reads the case records. He and his colleagues would bring in informants for questioning and ask them about Black Girl, and they soon learned she was worse than Booby. That is a specific and extraordinary statement. The Booby Boys were responsible for over 35 murders and more than 100 shootings. The lead investigator on the case concluded after years of work that the woman running the competing organization was more dangerous. Dowling had been building her operation since the early 1980s. She learned the cocaine business and eventually, after a key associate went to prison, took over his operation and expanded it. She managed a crew of 10 to 12 workers, ran a drug spot on 11th Terrace and 2nd Avenue Northwest in Overtown that operated around the clock, and enforced her authority through enforcers whose reputation for violence was well established in the neighborhood. She also paid extraordinarily well. Workers in her operation could clear $15,000 to $20,000 on a productive day, a compensation structure that bought loyalty in a neighborhood where those numbers represented more money than most people's parents earned in a year. The gang war between her organization and the Boobie Boys ran for 5 years, from 1993 to 1998, and produced at least 62 deaths and 36 additional wounded across the Miami area. Both organizations were eventually dismantled through federal prosecution. Dowling was convicted of cocaine conspiracy and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She served her sentence and was eventually released. The detail that captures who Avonda Dowling was in the world she operated in is the one Lewis offered. Of all the people he investigated in 30 years of Miami-Dade homicide work, she was the one who made even the most hardened informants lower their voice when they talked about her. Tonisa Welch, Detroit's first lady of the streets. Detroit in the late 1980s and early 1990s produced some of the most significant drug trafficking organizations in American history. The city's specific geography, its position as a major Midwest hub, its connections to Canadian border crossings, and the specific poverty of its most devastated neighborhoods combined to create a drug market that was both enormous and extraordinarily violent. It was in this environment that Tonisa Welch built her career and her reputation. Welch was involved with the White Boy Rick organization, one of the most significant drug trafficking networks in Detroit's history, before the federal government's dismantling of that operation. Her own operation in the years that followed made her one of the most significant female figures in Detroit's drug world, someone who understood both the supply chain and the organizational management required to run a serious operation, and who applied that understanding with enough discipline to build something that lasted. She was eventually convicted on federal drug trafficking charges and sentenced to federal prison. She served her time and came out, and in the years since her release, she has become perhaps the most publicly visible former female drug trafficker in American history. She co-starred in BMF, the Starz television series about the Black Mafia family produced by 50 Cent, and she has spoken publicly about her life in the drug trade, her prison years, and what she has built since. She calls herself the First Lady of the Streets, a title that was given to her by the Detroit streets, and that she has since reclaimed on her own terms. What makes Tonisa Welch significant in the context of this history is not just the organization she built or the time she served. It is the visibility she has chosen since her release. Most former drug traffickers who served federal time and came out recede from public view as a matter of survival and preference. Welch did the opposite. She used her story in full, including the parts that are not flattering, to build a public presence that engages directly with the questions that her history raises. Sandra Avila, Beltran, the Queen of the Pacific. Sandra Avila. Beltran built her reputation on one of the most valuable pieces of geography in the entire hemispheric drug trade, the Pacific smuggling corridor that connected Colombian cocaine supply to Mexican distribution networks, and from there into the United States. Born into a family already embedded in the trade, she was the niece of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the man known as the godfather of the Mexican drug trade, and she grew up around the business rather than discovering it as an adult. Over roughly a decade, Avila Beltran worked her way through the upper levels of Mexican trafficking organizations, eventually becoming a key liaison between Colombia's Norte del Valle cartel and Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. Investigators and journalists who covered her case described her as a central connector in the relationship between the two organizations, someone whose personal relationships with major traffickers, including her boyfriend, Juan Diego Espinoza Ramirez, known as the Tiger, gave her a level of access and trust that few women in that world were ever extended. Her nickname, La Reina del Pacifico, the Queen of the Pacific, was earned through her role developing and protecting smuggling routes along Mexico's Pacific coast into California. She was arrested in a Mexico City diner in September 2007 after years of building a public profile that mixed tabloid fame with genuine underworld power. Mexican authorities pursued organized crime and money laundering charges against her for years, with convictions overturned and reinstated more than once. She was eventually extradited to the United States, where she pleaded guilty in a Miami federal court to being an accessory after the fact for helping Espinoza evade arrest between 2002 and 2004. She was sentenced to time that closely matched what she had already served and was deported back to Mexico, where a Mexican court later threw out a related money laundering sentence entirely. Avila Beltran's case illustrates something specific about how female traffickers at the very top of international networks were treated differently than their male counterparts, both by the organizations that used them as connectors and by the legal systems that struggled to build cases that matched the scale of their actual influence. She was, by the account of nearly every investigator who worked her case, one of the most powerful women in the modern history of the Mexican drug trade. The formal record of what she was convicted of never fully caught up to that reputation. Thelma Wright, the Queen of Philly. Thelma Wright did not set out to run a drug empire. She met Jackie Wright, a wholesale heroin supplier with ties to Philadelphia's Black Mafia, in her early 20s, married him, and had a son. In 1986, Jackie was murdered, found rolled in a rug with a bullet in his head, leaving Thelma a young widow with a 4-year-old child and a set of business relationships that most people in her position would have walked away from immediately. She did not walk away. Using the connections her husband had built, Thelma Wright took over and expanded the operation, orchestrating the transport of cocaine and heroin between Philadelphia and Los Angeles. She has since said plainly that the money her husband left behind was not enough to live on, and that running the business was less a choice driven by greed than a decision made to survive and provide for her son. Whatever the motivation, she ran it well enough and carefully enough to remain at the center of Philadelphia's drug trade for 5 years without being arrested for it. What ended her run was not a raid or an indictment. It was a string of violence in 1991 that made the stakes impossible to ignore. She and her friends were caught in the crossfire of a shootout at a Philadelphia nightclub. A major client was arrested trying to move cocaine through the mail. Her supplier was executed by a rival organization within the same year. Reading those signs correctly, Wright walked away from the business entirely and never went back, a decision that meant she avoided the federal prosecution that eventually caught up with most of her contemporaries. In the years since, Thelma Wright has built one of the more unusual second acts among the women in this history. She published a memoir about her life in and out of the drug trade, started a foundation aimed at empowering women and steering at-risk teens away from the life she once led, and became a regular presence in schools and juvenile justice programs. Her story became the basis for a Starz feature and later inspired television development tied to Mary J. Blige. She is direct about the fact that she was never caught, and equally direct that the choice to stop was the only decision in her story she considers unambiguously right. Perion Roberts, the Queenpin of the South. Perion Roberts built her drug operation in the American South during the crack era, operating across multiple states and building a distribution network that law enforcement eventually documented as one of the more significant female-run drug trafficking organizations in the region. Roberts ran a crack cocaine operation with real organizational depth, suppliers, distributors, enforcers, and the specific financial management that any successful large-scale drug operation requires. She operated in the specific environment of Southern drug trafficking, which had its own characteristics distinct from the West Coast or New York models. The Southern markets were less saturated, police and infrastructure was often less sophisticated, and the geography of the region, with its highway networks connecting smaller cities and rural areas, created distribution opportunities that a smart operator could exploit. She was convicted on federal drug trafficking charges and sentenced to federal prison. In contrast to some of the other figures in this history, Roberts has been less publicly visible since her release, which means the detailed documentary record of her operation is thinner than those of women who have given extensive interviews or whose cases generated sustained media coverage. What the federal record does establish is the scope of what she built and the seriousness with which federal prosecutors treated her operation. Roberts's place in this history reflects something important about the geography of the American drug trade that tends to get overlooked in accounts that focus on New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The South produced its own drug trade infrastructure, its own organizational models, and its own significant figures. And among those figures were women who ran operations that crossed state lines and generated revenues that brought them to the attention of federal law enforcement. 7 women, 7 different cities and corridors, different products, different organizational models, different outcomes, and different choices about what to do with the life that followed incarceration, deportation, or in Thelma Wright's case, a clean exit that came before the law ever caught up. What they share is a specific and consistent demonstration that the assumption built into most public narratives about the drug trade, the assumption that the people building and running the most significant operations were men, was wrong. Not occasionally wrong, systematically, persistently, documentably wrong across decades and geography. The reasons these women's stories receive less prominent treatment than comparable male figures in the same trade are not difficult to identify. Law enforcement in the 1970s and 1980s was not looking for female kingpins. The media covering the drug trade reflected the same cultural assumptions about who ran these organizations, and the women themselves, in several cases, were deliberately low profile in ways that the most famous male drug traffickers were not, which meant they attracted less attention during their operational years and less retrospective attention afterward. One pattern worth naming directly is the difference in how these women tended to build their organizations compared to many of their male counterparts. The men who dominated the American drug trade at the same historical moments often built around personal dominance and visible power: the car, the jewelry, the entourage, the reputation for violence that preceded them into every room. That model signals status and enforces compliance, but it also makes you visible to law enforcement and creates a target for rivals. The women in this history tended to build differently. Brandy Davis moved through two of the most closely watched criminal networks in the country, her father's operation and BMF, without becoming the public face of either. Jemicker Thompson kept a low profile even at the peak of her operation's revenues. Thelma Wright ran her business quietly enough that she was never arrested for it at all. That structural modesty, not modesty about ambition or capability, but modesty about public visibility, made cases against them harder to build and often meant that by the time anyone was paying full attention to what they had actually built, it was already at a scale that requires significant resources to dismantle. None of that changes what these operations produced in the communities where they ran. The crack cocaine that moved through South Central Los Angeles and the cocaine that moved through Detroit and Philadelphia and the Pacific Corridor did not become less destructive because the people running the supply chains kept lower profiles than their male competitors. The families broken by addiction, the children raised without a parent, the 62 people killed in the war between Avonda's organization and the Booby Boys, those outcomes were the same regardless of who sat at the top. But the record is there. Brandy Davis rose to prominence in Detroit through her father's operation and her ties to the Black Mafia family. Jemicker Thompson ran crack distribution across South Central. Avonda Dowling went to war with the Booby Boys and held her ground for 5 years against one of Miami's most violent organizations. Tonisa Welch built a name in Detroit serious enough to earn her the title the streets conferred on her. Sandra, Avila, Beltran became one of the most important connectors between Colombian and Mexican trafficking networks. Thelma Wright ran Philadelphia's heroin and cocaine trade for 5 years and walked away clean. Perry and Roberts ran a multi-state operation through the American South. The next time someone describes the history of the American drug trade as if it was a story primarily about men, these are the names that belong in the response. The history has always had women in it. It has simply chosen, most of the time, not to say so. That omission is not a small one. It shapes what gets taught, what gets adapted into film and television, and what young investigators are trained to look for when they walk into a new case. Every one of the 7 women in this history operated for years, in some cases more than a decade, before law enforcement fully understood who they were dealing with. That delay was not an accident of bad luck. It was the direct result of a set of assumptions about gender and power that these women exploited, deliberately or not, to build organizations that outlasted and in several cases outperformed their male counterparts. Correcting the record is not about glamorizing what they did. It is about telling an accurate story of how the American drug trade actually worked and who actually ran it.